Hey everybody, Jay Weidner, Reality Check. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe, grow the channel and all that. Somehow I can't get over 25,000. I don't know what's going on. Some people are telling me there's an algorithm or something that YouTube has, and if they don't like your show, then they kind of put jams in you or something. Anyway, today I got a really interesting show. Paul Elder is well, Paul, how would you describe yourself? I mean,
Um, I'm
remote
not sure.
viewer. You're a remote
Um,
viewer. You study at the Monroe Institute, and you had several out of the body experiences, right?
well, I think probably I'm a former politician and former network news reporter, and the only reason I tell people that is because people have this notion that politicians and reporters aren't the kind of people that would ever stretch the truth. So just checking to see if everyone's awake. Excuse me. But yeah, most importantly, I've had a number of near-death experiences. I've died several times, and coming out of that began a series of amazing out-of-body experiences, and so it led me down a pathway, changed my life, totally, from politics and business and everything else to exploring consciousness itself, and came upon the Monroe Institute in Virginia. And I've been a trainer there, an instructor, for just about 20 years now. And they developed this process called the hemisync, or a special sound technology that takes people to deep altered states of consciousness.
Yeah. So, when you had your near-death experience, your first one, what did you do? What happened to you? You must have. Was there an instant change, or was it you just pondering it for a long time before you changed?
Well, to give you a little bit of a background, I grew up in the prairies in Saskatchewan, Canada, and I came from a large Catholic family. There's a redundant statement. My mother had 8 girls in a row, and then figured out what was happening and changed the dial and had 3 boys. And
Wow.
I'm the 10th out of 11 kids.
Wow.
And on this particular, I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere and we had nothing. We were poorer than the proverbial church mice kind of thing. And one summer when I was 12 years old, my cousins were visiting from the big city of Edmonton, and we ended up, about 1.5 miles from our home, on the prairies. They call these dugouts, but they're like big ponds. And we came upon a raft that the owner or the neighbor's kids had abandoned, kind of thing. And my little brother and I had been warned to stay away from these ponds because we couldn't swim. And so at any rate, we very quickly find ourselves bobbing around on this raft in the middle of this 15-foot deep pond. And my older cousin thought it would be perhaps a lot of fun rocking the raft, and you see, and what happened, well, I fell in. So if you wondered why you've had no bad luck in your life, it's because Murphy lives with me. And so as a result of that, I fell in, and I didn't even have the presence of mind to dog paddle. I had no idea. I was instantly freaked out and panicked and just sank like a rock, and headed to the bottom of this pond. And I could feel, at some point, I could feel my feet sinking into the mud at the bottom. And I must have pushed or kicked, and I lifted up again or floated up to the top. And I'm not sure if my head broke the surface or whatever, but I could tell that the water, everything was getting lighter, so it was close to the top. And then I sank again. And most interesting thing happened, because while I'm sinking in this water, at some point, all the air went out and the water came in.
Right.
And I was completely blown away, because I had and we've all had this experience, whether it's in in a swimming pool or in the ocean or in a lake somewhere. As you grow up, having your first experience of sucking in a big gulp of water and the panic that comes with it and the reaction, the instant terrifying reaction. And I was totally amazed at this, because when all the air went out and the water came in, there was absolutely no stress, no struggle. And I guess, in fact, there was a strange peacefulness to it.
Yeah.
And I guess it makes sense, because that's how we came into life. We spent the first 9 months of our lives in a liquid environment. And, so my lungs may have been moving or trying to breathe, but it was water coming in and out. Well, eventually what happens is you lose consciousness, because there's not enough oxygen in the water. And I floated, or just drifted into darkness, but in some way I was almost concerned that I wasn't concerned, and at some point I became conscious or aware, and suddenly snapped back into awake, if you will. And I was still in the water, and I was at the bottom on my hands or knees in the mud kind of thing. And everything had changed. It was like I was in a bubble of energy, but in this bubble of energy was every color in the rainbow. And it was just remarkable. And I remember so clearly all these colors vibrating through me. And I remember moving my hands through these colors and thinking, oh my God, I didn't know you could feel colors, because each color had a different vibration, had a different feeling to it. And blue felt different than green, and green felt different than red, and so on and so forth. And I was just amazed at it. And after a few moments, it must have came to the realization that, wow, this is weird. Am I dead or am I dying? I had never experienced anything like that before. And when I thought about it, my only reference, I didn't even know anybody who had died. So my only reference to dying was, I had read the book Tom Sawyer a couple of weeks before this. And in the book Tom Sawyer, if I remember correctly, Tom is believed to have drowned in the Mississippi, and he returns home in time for his own funeral service, or his own memorial service. And with that thought, I went instantly shooting out of the water. And the next thing I know, I'm floating over the choir loft in the back of our big old Catholic church out in the country, floating. And I was totally amazed, and because I was perfectly fine, but I'm thinking, Tom Sawyer didn't float. I'm floating. I'm flying, and this was so cool. And I could, just by thinking about it, I could control my movements, moving over. And sometimes I went over the edge and looking down 16 feet. That was a little scary. And at some point in this, I was just so amazed by this process. And at some point, it was like I had been kicked in the stomach, and there was this instant gasp. And the next thing I know, I'm back on the shore, and my cousin Brian had me upside down, and he was pumping the water out of me. My face was bouncing in the mud and pumping the water out of me, because I've been in the water for like 6 or 7 minutes apparently.
Oh.
And so it was just sort of, that was I think the thing, I did not realize, I was 12 years old. When you're 12 years old and out in the middle of nowhere, growing up in the country, and something weird happens, you go, well, that was weird, and you go on with life, right?
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much that had changed me until many, many years into the future. It changed me in subtle ways that weren't sort of, that I couldn't detect. Excuse me. For instance, I could see things in my mind after that. And if something was missing or lost or whatever, and I had 8 sisters, right? So oftentimes things got missing or got lost. And even my sisters can vouch for this, because I could tell them, or I could see things. And so it would be like, oh, geez, you can't find that. Go ask Paul, which led them to believe sometimes that I was the one that took it. And sometimes I did, because that's how you build your own legend. It's like, let me see. So, but I didn't realize, to me, it was just sort of a quirkiness about myself. And I didn't pay attention to it until I didn't realize how much it had changed me until much later in life. And when I was 17, I got into a car accident, a severe car accident. We were going like 85 miles an hour on a November road in Saskatchewan, a gravel road, and went end over end and smashed this 64 Ford or whatever it was, into oblivion. And I was unconscious, and ended up in the hospital, and lost a kidney and a hockey career. And but it was another one of those things. And later on, I've had 5 in total now.
Wow.
5 near-death experiences. So one of these damn days, I'm going to get it right. All right. But in the meantime, it's sort of like, and I figured something out, because people will ask me and say, well, why do you think 5 near-death experiences? And I'm thinking, because if you show a 12-year-old kid on the farm that there's no such thing as dead, that is dangerous. Because what's the worst that could happen? Of course, hold my beer, right? That old story. And so it just sort of opened my life, I think, to pushing the limits of everything, because I somehow inherently knew that there is no death. And that has sort of proven out over the years. So sort of to bring this around in a circle, and many years later, I got into broadcasting. I was a broadcaster, a news announcer in Canada, first a disc jockey, and so on and so forth, for about 10 years, and including with CTV, National Network at the end. And then I got into politics after that. I was the mayor of a city in Saskatchewan.
Really?
Yeah, for a whole bunch of years. A little city, about 18,000 population, called Swift Current, which is just north of Montana, a couple of hours. And spent a lot of time in mainstream politics and broadcasting, as I mentioned. And I think what happened is I was endeavoring to move into mainstream politics, if you will, at a party level, and had been encouraged to run for the Conservative Party in Saskatchewan. This is many, many years ago. And on if I recall, the night for the deciding this was on a Monday, and this was a Friday night, and I had fully planned on running, and I awakened at about 3 in the morning or whatever, where I became aware that something was bumping. I was bumping up against the ceiling, and I looked down, and I was just shocked, because I could see myself in bed with my wife, and it freaked me out. And the reason I say this, and instantly I went shooting back into my body, and I had heard about around 1981 or something like that. I had watched a television interview with a fellow named Robert Monroe, and he had written a book called Journeys Out of the Body. And in this book, in this book, he described, having these out of body sessions, if you will, or astral projections. And anyway, he wrote this book called Journeys Out of the Body, and I thought, that's cool. That sounds really cool, because I'd had some experiences, in sort of out of body with my near-death experiences. And so I borrowed the book from the library, read it from cover to cover, and I thought, that's cool, but this guy's a nut job, right? And I took it back to the library and forgot all about it. So here it is, like 10, 11 years later, floating at the ceiling of my bedroom. One of the first things that came to my mind was, holy smoke, Monroe wasn't crazy. This is real. And it was like a huge message. I did not sleep anymore that night. And the next day I withdrew from the running for, as a member of the legislature for that district. And basically went back to the library and found out that Bob Monroe had written another book called Far Journeys. And in the book, he described having created this facility in Virginia, first in upstate New York, in which he had developed this process, a patented process called hemispheric synchronization, or hemisync, and actually proven in laboratories to be able to alter brain waves and move people into deep altered states of consciousness. And I thought, I have got to check this out, because I had this most amazing experience that I wouldn't have believed. And so first opportunity, I signed up and I headed off to Virginia, and basically fell in love. People from all over the world come there, you know, two dozen at a time, and you can move into deep states of consciousness, explore your own consciousness, have out-of-body experiences, so on and so forth. And I just I got to meet Bob Monroe, and we hit it off really well. I think probably, you know, because in part because we were both, Bob Monroe was also a former broadcaster, and he was actually the creator or the producer of radio shows back in the old days. And so and he was interested in politics, and we hit it off. And he had asked me even then, after I had gone, because I returned several times, a number of times to the Monroe Institute to take more programs. And each time I went, I fell in love with the place even more. And so Bob had been encouraging me, asking me to, if I would like to be a trainer or an instructor at the Institute. And I just kept putting him off, saying, Bob, you know, I'm running a city and I own an insurance brokerage firm then. You know, it's like I'm running a city and a business. I haven't got time for this. And so, you know, so we headed off really well. And then many years later, a number of years later, Bob passed away. I think it was in 2000 or 1995 or 1996. I'm not sure. And after that, his daughter Lori took over and eventually convinced me to become a trainer. She would say, "Daddy always said you'd be a good trainer," you know. And so, after I got out of politics, it made way for that. And so, that's the start of it. And I attended, you know, at the Monroe Institute in Virginia, and I taught. I was hired essentially to teach something called remote viewing, which is sort of a misnomer because it should be called remote sensing. And so I taught remote viewing at the Monroe Institute for, I think, around 10 years with a fellow named Skip Atwater. And it was an interesting sort of relationship. One of the things that came out of that, I got to, in the early years with Bob and with some of the other personnel at the Monroe Institute, I got to go into what they call their laboratory or their lab, their isolation chamber. And some of the things that I experienced and some of the things I told them about got somebody's attention. And one day, or I was at some point, I was introduced to some amazing people. And one of them was a fellow named Dale Graff. And I was told about this top secret program that they had going, in the U.S. intelligence services, called remote viewing. And I wasn't sure if I believed it. Anyway, they thought that I might have some abilities in that. And so I had no idea. And, so I began to sort of take a look at it and, did some training in remote viewing. And then I found out later on that the fellow that I was teaching was invited to teach remote viewing at the Institute in Virginia, a guy named Skip Atwater. And he was like, a techie. He was the guy whose voice would be in my headphones when I'm in the isolation chamber, interrupting me when I'm having, a movement in consciousness. And I discovered that this mild-mannered lab techie named Skip actually used to be called Captain Fred Atwater, and he was the manager of this top secret program at Fort Meade, Maryland, called Project Stargate. It had evolved through the years in a number of different names, but ended up being called Stargate. And he had been the manager at the facility, the main facility in Fort Meade in Maryland. And after I found out that, then all of this sort of made sense. And thought, oh my God, that's how this is all came about. So I spent, well, I think about 10 years teaching the program with Skip at the Institute. And over that period of time, got to work with a lot of different folks who were in various aspects in the Stargate program. And the program was sort of shelved, if you will, I think around 1995, after 23 years of that work, or at least that's what folks are told, right?
Yes.
Now, I want to say that it was pretty amazing. Some of the people in it, like Joe McMonagle, some of the mainstays that were in Stargate, had amazing, abilities, using their psychic abilities to be able to describe any person, place, thing, or event happening in, anywhere in the universe, if you will. And so it was just a very powerful program. Now, I have to say that I'm Canadian, so I never ever worked for Stargate, but I have helped out occasionally with American intelligence, tracking down missing people, tracking down bad people, stuff like that.
So it's basically what you use your astral body to roam into a place and see what's going on or what's there. Is that what it is?
Well, it's I wish it was that simply described. The reality is that this is an innate ability that every single human being on the planet has. This is who we really are, the ability to be able to connect in consciousness. All right. So it's not necessarily like going out of body, because we have this, one of the biggest sort of stepping stones in out of body research, astral projection, is people have the notion that we have to go through some kind of a vibrational lift out and have, the reality is that every single one of us, if we move into an altered or into really deep relaxation, all right, every single one of us, we go out of body every single night as we go to sleep, as we drift off. But every human being on the planet has the ability to move in consciousness. It's that part of us, and we've all experienced this before, where you might be sitting in the middle of nowhere or at the mall or wherever it is, or out in the park, and you get the sense or feeling that somebody's watching you, and you turn around and sure enough, there was somebody there. What part of you knew that? What part of you knew that your cousin was about to call? What part of you knew that, what part of a mom knows her kid's in trouble 3,000 miles away? It's that part of us, the spirit part, that binds everything together, because we are existing at multiple levels of consciousness, if you will. And there are no limitations for this. And so it's not really, remote viewing is probably a misnomer. It probably should be called remote sensing. It's not so much, although now having said all of this, the actual process that they developed, this was developed by folks like Ingo Swann and Pat Price at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park in California, where you'll have people like Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, who were physicists, fully, accredited physicists who worked with lasers and things like that. And they began researching consciousness itself, or psychic phenomena. And if you will, I can tell you where that background came from, because it's an important part of the story. And back in the 70s, 72, 73, so on and so forth, CIA had intelligence that the Soviets had trained psychics who could spy on America. Literally, they could be sitting in a darkened room in Moscow and drawing diagrams of missile sites in the States. That, of course, really concerned them. And so they had no idea, how do we deal with this? So the only people, or some of the people that they knew that might have some answers to this, were at the Stanford Research Institute. They had done some work with Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff there. And so they approached Stanford, and a CIA agent, Kip Green, was one of the first people that went to see them and talked to them about it and said, hey, we got a problem. We got the Soviets that supposedly, we got evidence that they're able to, to access things mentally, as spies. And that's a big concern, and asking him, well, is this possible? And they said, well, yeah, probably. And of course, it begs the second question. So we're just like, well, how do we defend against it? And they said sort of, I'm summarizing, they said, good luck. You can't. But it begged a third question. That question might have been, well, is this something we can do? And of course, Targ and Puthoff are like, yes, by golly, we're going to try it. And so they were given a contract, I think an 8-month contract, and $50-some thousand to develop this process, or take a look at the possibilities of creating this sensory program, if you will. And at first, when they started, it began as Scan8, and then it became Grill Flame, and a number of other names before it, was eventually, I think, Dale Graff was the fellow who finally named it, or changed the name to Stargate. And over the years, they were working with two very gifted psychics at that particular time. They were doing the kind of thing that I suppose you would normally do to test psychic abilities. So they would have, for instance, they're working with this guy named Ingo Swann, who was an eccentric artist and a psychic from New York City, and a fellow named Pat Price, who was a former homicide detective from Los Angeles. And they were doing the typical things you might do, like, here's 5 cards on the table here. One of them has a picture underneath. Which one is it? And they had amazing results just in doing that, going into a calm, a very quiet, calm place. All right. And so they had some amazing results. And when the CIA showed up, they had this project that they needed to work on for them to see if they could do the same thing as the Soviets were supposedly doing. And it was mostly Ingo Swann who put together this protocol. Ingo had the ability, or the smarts, to know that we are all connected to this, but in order to move into that right hemisphere of our mind, which is connected to the rest of the universe, we have to quiet the left hemisphere. That part of us that is analytic, that tries to figure things out, that tries to be first, and so on and so forth. And knowing that was sort of the basic protocol of what they call this process, Stargate, or remote viewing protocol, which really, as I mentioned, should be called remote sensing, because it's not so much about viewing, it's more about sensing. And it's like, and they would start out with let's say, to test people. And as they did with Kit Green, when he came back after, the 8-month study, and to test them and see if they could really do it. And if I recall, my memory, I think Kit had a summer home somewhere in Virginia, and he used that as a target, took a photograph of that and the geographical coordinates, and put the geographical coordinates on this envelope, which contained his, the pictures of his summer home. And from what I've been told, and that headed out to California and wouldn't even let them touch it, that no, here's the envelope, here's the numbers, see what you can do. And Pat Price and Ingo Swann, both of them started out very accurately talking about a forested, hilly environment, right? And which seemed to be correct because that's where Kit's house was, or summer home. And then Pat Price went off the road somewhere, and he was talking about this top secret underground bunker. And Kit Green is going, oh my God, what a waste of time, And so, and Pat Price described even the names of the people that he thought worked in this bunker. He described the names that he perceived to be on some of the file cabinets that were in this top secret bunker. And of course, Kit Green was going, oh my God, it's my summer home, I'm just paraphrasing. Don't want to be speaking for Kit. But very disappointed. Headed off back to Virginia, thinking, well, that was a waste of 8 months and $50,000, and gets back home. And from the story that I'm told, as after a couple of weeks, he headed out of Langley or wherever he was to his home in the woods, and driving into the yard, and he's concerned about it and fretting that about the waste of money and time. And he looks up on the hill behind his house, and it took a fair while for him to crawl up that hill, but he noticed a glinting. Oh, this is one of the things that Pat Price had described was large communication towers and rounded, huge communication discs. And so here's Kit Green seeing a glint of metal up on the hillside, and crawls up there and gets up top, and sure enough, there's a communication tower, and there's these large communication discs. If you remember, the first satellite dishes for like 17 feet of aluminum, and next thing you know, he is arrested or whatever, or detained, because he had encroached upon a top secret underground bunker that NSA had, not CIA, in which they were, had been doing a whole bunch of different things. And you can imagine the stink that hit the fan, because they were horrified that they thought for sure there had to be a leak somewhere, because there's no way anybody could describe the things that Pat Price described without being connected to it. Anyway, long story short, they checked it all out, among other things that they had been doing in the meantime, and came to the conclusion that, holy smoke, this was real, this was accurate. And so that is when they began in earnest to put together the program that ran for a number of years, many years. And it involved every aspect, or every agency, from Defense Intelligence Agency to DIA to CIA, FBI, everything from tracking down drug runners to terrorists and so on and so forth. And so like I say, being
So
a
you're saying
Canadian,
all the alphabet agencies were using it?
yes, pretty much, yeah. And yeah, and oftentimes could never describe how they were able to get the information, obviously, because it was a secret program, and and you got to keep the secret.
I would say it just went underground. They just wanted to get rid of the obvious program and make something that was that no one knows about. I would say it's still going on. It would never get rid of something that valuable.
Well, from what I'm told, there was a fundamental Christian senator. They had to apply for funding on a yearly basis almost to prove why they, and they were using, at first, they were using Ingo Swann's process or protocol for remote viewing. They were using, and Pat Price as well. They were using what they called, just geographical coordinates, right? So, and what I'm told is that on a few years, or every few years, they had to reapply to prove this. And on this one particular occasion, they're having to the Joint Chiefs of Staff or whoever asking questions about it. And so they brought in Ingo Swann to a meeting with with these higher ups, and there was a test target that they gave him. One of the generals put this together or whatever, and it was the island where they did the first nuclear test, Bikini Atoll, I think,
Yeah.
and which is basically an island in the Pacific. And so Ingo is sort of on the spot, and here's the coordinates, and he starts off describing palm trees, oceans, and sand and stuff like that, and, pretty much described this island, right? And what I'm told is that one of the generals or whatever, one of the, the staff members said, well, that's a crock. Everybody knows that longitude, latitude, such and such is Bikini Atoll. And they went, what? And so they called this the guess the coordinates of the globe trick, which is even more bizarre than you can imagine. But it proved in so many ways, but they had to sort of keep reapplying for this. Now, as you suspect, or as you mentioned, if you have something that is that accurate, like during the Iran crisis and the hostage taking and so on and so forth, even after after say 9/11 and other incidents like that, there were definitely a lot of remote viewers that were from Ingo Swann to Pat Price to Joe McMonagle to Lynn Buchanan to Dave Morehouse and Mel, on and on, just many people that are working in the program, and Skip Atwater and so on and so forth. And they had developed a pretty amazing protocol on an accuracy on putting together data that could not be obtained any other way. And there's some, if you get access to the records, and thankfully more and more of this is being released now, along with UFO records and things of that nature. So thankfully we're becoming more and more familiar with, this process, if you will.
So what do you think the most important thing that Project Stargate achieved? Is there any one particular remote viewing session that was just so mind-blowing that, it kind of changed everything?
Well, I think more than one. There were just numerous examples. They discovered a whole bunch of other things, like the best time of day and something called sidereal time, and so on and so forth. So, but there were numerous examples that were head scratching. It's like nobody could come up with that information.
Did Ingo Swann find a base on the moon or something?
Well, Ingo did a lot of interesting things, and yeah, the Ingo was an amazing person. He was a little eccentric, but Ingo talked about it. He wrote a book called Penetration.
Yep.
And in the book, he talked about, the extraterrestrials that are among us already, including, something on the moon. And it's sort of an interesting thing, because now we're getting back there.
We hope. They've delayed it again, but we hope the Artemis gets back there.
Right. Well, I think there's nowhere. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, that's a part of it, and including, and I've been saying this for years now, including the existence of extraterrestrials. And if you're familiar, there over the years, there's and now NASA is bringing out, or the government is releasing information on extraterrestrial vehicles and possible situations that occurred, and so on and so forth. So it is opening up, and I think we're within a few short years of full disclosure of the landing on the lawn kind of thing. But as this has sort of been slowly opened up, it's like sort of a controlled dissemination of information over the last few years, including the existence of extraterrestrial bases on planet Earth. And this is now probably, oh my gosh, it's probably 5-6 years ago now. we knew about certain things that were happening, and there were some amazing remote viewings.
Well, yeah. Well, Pat Price found the base in Alaska, right?
Right, and Joe McMoneagle, well, Pat, there was actually, at first, and what happened is the CIA at some point, or the intelligence services, said, okay, you can release this. And myself, and I was working with, Captain Atwater then at the Institute of Virginia, and I was shocked by it, and Skip as well. And in which they revealed these super top secret remote viewings of extraterrestrial bases on planet Earth.
Yeah.
And I thought, holy crap, this is so cool, but why are they releasing this? And one of those bases, the closest for us, was Mount Hayes in Alaska.
Right.
And it was Pat Price who had, now here's a twist in it, and I actually have the release. I actually have the slides and a presentation that was released with this in showing Pat Price's remote viewing and his drawings, and Joe McMoneagle, who also did the same thing, and Mel Riley and a few others who worked on and came up with the same solutions independently. All right, and the same descriptions of extraterrestrial bases on planet Earth. And like Mount Hayes, as you're talking about, which is pretty cool because we have here on Vancouver Island, where I live, we are in a hotbed of extraterrestrial activity.
Underwater.
Right, and part of it is that we are also this area here, the bay in Alaska, if you will, is just north of us, of Vancouver Island. And so we also have a commercial flight corridors, like even aircraft that are from Seattle or LA or whatever, that are heading overseas or over to Japan or whatever. They make this loop to the north, right?
Yep.
So it's also, in addition to being a flight corridor for commercial aircraft, it's also a corridor with a lot of sightings. And
I used to live in Port Townsend, Washington, right across the San Juan de Fuca Straits from Vancouver. I could see the lights at night on Vancouver Island, and I actually did see a craft come out of the water one day.
Very cool.
Yeah.
We this is one of my favorite passions. I always was sort of open to the possibilities. I mean, I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and so the first that I came across some of this was a former defense minister of Canada, a fellow named Paul Hellyer.
Oh, yeah.
And Paul just died not too long ago now, in his 90s. And he had been the defense minister for like 20 years or something like that. And Paul was speaking at the Ottawa Press Club or some such location. This is a number of years ago. And one of the Stephen Hawking, had made a statement on a documentary that Paul thought was completely ludicrous. He had made the statement that if it was possible for intelligence at some corner of the universe to be able to get here and to overcome the problem of millions of light years of travel, that they would be so advanced that we should be really worried, because they would be here to rape our planet of its resources, and we would be like ants to them. Well, Paul was asked about that, and he just sort of lit up on Stephen Hawking about what a ridiculous statement that was. And Paul said something to the extent of, they're here. They've been here for thousands of years. We don't have to go somewhere else to find them. They're here. And he said something to the extent of, where do you think we're getting so much of the technology we have today?
Yeah.
And that sort of opened that whole can, because here's a guy who would know. He's the defense minister. And when you take a look at it, the existence of extraterrestrials, who and you ask the question, who would stand to lose the most if ET is real?
Well, people in charge.
Well, maybe, maybe not. Fundamental religion,
That's true. That's true.
which is people in charge to some degree. So how would that fit into the plans of billions of people on the planet? If all of a sudden, so when you
That's
talk
definitely
about
what the Brookings report said in, I think, 1961. They put out a report saying that it would, knowledge of extraterrestrials would shatter society, would shatter scientists. Actually, they said the most. That there were most, they said the religious and scientific communities would be the most shattered by the knowledge of extraterrestrials.
yes, precisely. And one of the things, like if you think about this, and I was raised a Catholic, and one of the things that came out a few years ago, and this is, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago. When you have, I mean, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, is a sovereign nation, right? They're actually a country. They're a sovereign nation.
Yeah.
And so when you have the Catholic Church that comes out and makes a declaration like they did several years ago that said the existence of extraterrestrials wouldn't necessarily be outside the scope of Catholicism, you know something's coming.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Yeah.
it would refute a whole bunch of things about religion itself if this is outside of God and our perceptions of creation and God and so on and so forth.
So you think these extraterrestrials that are here, you guys that were remote viewing them and everything, are they basically humanoid, or are they like really weird and different than us?
Well, there are, I've actually had the opportunity or the privilege of remote viewing ET on a few bases, on a few occasions. And the most common, apparently there are 4 main races that are within our vicinity, or that come in and out of our programming here. And the grays are the most common, are the little guys that we become familiar with to some degree. They're the ones that I've had most of my experience with. Now, apparently there are other beings that taller, so on and so forth. And Angus Swan had talked about them on in his book Penetration, and exist among us to some degree. And I have had the opportunity to do remote viewing, sort of official or semi-official kind of remote viewing regarding extraterrestrials and the whole notion of why they're here and so on and so forth. There was, and there's an understanding. So, but the reality is, if you have the intelligence and the technology and the ability to travel millions of light years to be here now, these beings can be so superior to our concepts, and some people will ask, well, are they the good ones or the bad ones? I don't believe at this point that we have any bad ones, because if we did, we'd be so toast.
Yeah.
Right. We have no defense against anything like that. So I think it's but there are some explanations that go along with it. And here's one of the things. See, I get to, over the years of teaching remote viewing at the Monroe Institute in Virginia and here in Canada as well, I've met some amazing people, and including some folks from NASA. And this was probably around 2008, 2009, something like that. A fellow that came to the Monroe Institute in Virginia, where we were teaching one of the programs, remote viewing. And on Saturday, when we all collect, and these are people from all over the world, really, and everyone sort of goes around the room, introduces themselves, and close to the end of it, this fellow stands up and he says, "Hi, my name is Philip. I'm a rocket scientist," and he sits down. And we all kind of giggled because, like, hey, I ain't no rocket scientist, but but he was a rocket scientist. And I was like, what? And anyway, this Philip Schaffel. I cannot remember his last name. All the time. He was Houston ground control. He was one of the people who would have been communicating, with the astronauts, who saw extraterrestrials and said, Commander Mitchell, you did not see that. All right. So it was an interesting thing. So I was on this poor guy, because I thought this is the most interesting dude on the planet. He was, mission commander, Schaffer, I think, or Schaffer, Philip Schaffer. I don't know why I can't remember his last name. But we actually became, good friends. And during the during the week that we were there, at every opportunity, I wanted to find out more from him. And it's like, okay, Philip, both the Soviets and Americans were after the moon. And there was a number of Apollo projects or Apollo moon landings that were still on the papers. And then all of a sudden, both the Soviets and Americans just quit going to the moon. And they didn't talk about it. And they didn't explain, well, we can't afford it, or it's too, it's too far away, it's too difficult, anything like that. They just quit. And so there was speculation, why did they quit? And the speculation was because ET said, bugger off from the moon, right? And so I was like all over Philip, like, gee, Philip, here, you shouldn't have to walk, let me carry you, and trying to get the inside track. And he would always, he said, well, and because I'm asking him, obviously very much, classified secret, questions. And he said, well, assuming that I knew, do you think I could tell you? And go on, stuff like that. And had an interesting experience because this was around 2009. And a couple of months later, because we communicated a few times, and because I was always pushing him for more answers, and because I thought, this is the coolest guy in the world, he talks to these astronauts while they're on the moon. And I'm returning from the Monroe Institute in Virginia about 2 months later from, they fly me in there several times a year to teach these classes. And I'm after a wait in Washington, DC, a transfer, a plane shift or whatever, back on the flight, and I started nodding off, and all of a sudden, in front of me is the face of Philip Schaffer, and he just goes like this, big smile, and it's gone. And I was like, holy crap, that wasn't a dream, that was a spirit. And I thought, this is weird. And so when I got home, I called up, or sent a note to Skip Atwater, or Captain Atwater, and I said, this is a weird experience I had. This guy from NASA suddenly appeared in front of me, but it didn't feel like it, And I said, what do you think? And so about 2 days later, Skip sent me a note back, or phoned me, I can't remember which one it was, and said, by golly, that is weird, because guess what? Philip passed away about 2 weeks ago. Back to give me, so anyway, when we get into things like that, now I've met over the years, and some amazing people also have had at the Monroe Institute, had, some of the engineers from NASA and so on and so forth, and I'd be peppering them with questions like, come on. And so there's some interesting, we're moving, our knowledge base is going to become broadened like crazy in the next short while. Because as you know, now we're finally, or NASA and other agencies are finally releasing intelligence on extraterrestrials themselves and so on and so forth, including all of a sudden, including discussing extraterrestrial bases on planet Earth.
I've
And
been told that by someone who's actually met one of them, a guy high up in a foreign intelligence agency, that they're going to introduce it to us by the end of this year. So that's what I've been told. So we'll see.
yes, it's going to be.
They're softening us up for it, though. So I wanted to make sure that you mentioned that you're going to Egypt in March, right?
Well, that's sort of the hope. That's the plan. It's been on my bucket list for a long time, and actually done some remote viewing regarding Egypt and so on and so forth. I want to mention one other person considering Vancouver Island here. If you're aware, if you have known of this person, her name is Beverly Trout. And Beverly came to a remote viewing workshop in Virginia about 10, 12, 13 years ago or whatever. And we became good friends. But Beverly was an interesting gal. She was the former president of MUFON, Mutual UFO Organization, and she was an expert on crop circles. So she had been on something like 50 radio and television programs talking about what she found in crop circles around the world, kind of thing. And it was very well voiced, but you would expect, and we became good friends, and you would expect, perhaps someone who was into that might be a bit of a flight risk. But Beverly was is an Iowa farm girl, all right? She down home as you can get. She doesn't call a spade, she calls it an effing shovel, right? just kidding. And so a number of years ago, she let me know that she was going to be visiting in Vancouver, some convention of some kind. And I said, well, you can't come to Vancouver and not come over to the island. And so she and her niece came over for a weekend, and I showed them around the place. And Victoria, the whole island kind of thing, driving them all over the place. There's some amazing, beautiful sights in here.
Beautiful place.
Yeah, and there's this one lake, and we're down in Victoria, showing them the Parliament buildings and so on and so forth. And in the evening, as we're coming back from Victoria, and we're on, what we call the drive, over the hump, through the forest, heading back to Port Alberni, where I lived then, and we're going past Cameron Lake. And this lake is one of the deepest lakes on the planet. All right. Some call it bottomless and so on and so forth. But even back when I was 20 years old, many, many years ago, working in the forest industry, and the old guys around Port Alberni would say things like, there's something in that lake, but it was sort of like the Loch Ness Monster, Ogopogo kind of a notion, right? And so I heard those stories over the years, and people would often talk about that, because it was considered a bottomless lake, and it has some of the purest water on the planet. All right, this is water that is a melt off and has been running over the same rocks for millions of years, and while every other lake in the area pretty much is warm and natural kind of thing, Cameron Lake is almost too cold to even get in. And anyway, long story short, we are driving along on this drive through the forest, and as we're coming around the corner of this area of Cameron Lake, and Beverly Trout is in the back seat of my car, and I hear Beverly say, "Oh my God, what on earth is that?" And I said, "What?" And look over to the right, and out about a half a mile into the lake, I swear this, there was it looked like probably 100 yards, 150 yard, perfect circle on this almost mirror-like glass water, all right, in the lake, something vibrating, like a perfect circle, 100 yards across, and we're just sort of like, whoa, what on earth? Absolutely placid lake. Of all the people on the planet that I would want to have in my backseat that would notice this would be Beverly Trout. She'd investigated all of this stuff. And unfortunately, there was a semi-trailer right in my back end, and honking, and I would, so we had to keep driving, and on through the forest there in the island here, heading that way. You can only go as fast as the slowest guy. So by the time we could pull over and turn around, come back, it was gone. Other people have seen it. A friend of mine saw it as well, as I did. And so what was that? So here's an interesting study for you. We'd heard so much talk about this, and other people had seen this huge circle vibrating underneath the placid water in Cameron Lake. Some people had claimed to have seen a spout of water coming up into a vehicle of some kind. All right. And so it was, what happened here, and this is on record now, there was so much talk about the strange things on the lake that the government or the university or whoever it was decided to do a study. And this is now about, I think, 5 years ago or whatever. They came out and they sent an investigative crew, and they came out with their boats and everything to examine, and they had deep water radar and all sorts of heavy duty equipment. And they spent about 2 months on the lake, going back and forth, and doing their investigation. After it was all over, the only thing that they reported, typical government kind of stuff, they said there are enough large moving anomalies in the lake to warrant further investigation. That was it. All right. So when we have, and so I've done some remote viewing, as I mentioned before, and I'm lucky enough to know people like Beverly Trout, who's been investigating crop circles and things of that nature for her entire life. And when we have what we heard just last year, I think, when NASA announced that on the backside of the moon, the largest crater is full of ice, frozen water. How did it get there? The moon is basically powder dust, the entire thing. Backside of the moon, the largest crater is full of water. How did it get there? From Cameron Lake and places like that on the planet. So some new interesting things.
Lots of UFOs been seen pulling water out. I think that they get their water from Earth and their food also. Yeah. But listen, Paul, it's been great having you on Reality Check. And hopefully you'll get to go to Egypt.
Well, that sure is the plan, because done just a minor amount of work there, but it's just, to me, it's on my bucket list of the most important places to visit at some point.
I've been there several times. It's an amazing place. So I hope you get there. Anyway, thanks so much for having a chat with me, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thank you very much, Jay. You have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you soon.
And this is Reality Check, and I'm Jay Weidner, and thanks for watching.